Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening on the first podcast that we've done. Tonight, Wolf Grodd is joining me, 87 and been involved in classic cars nearly his entire life. And Wolf started Sleeping Beauties in 1988. Wolf, thank you for coming on.
People say to me, why don't you retire and enjoy life? They don't get it. This is not what I do. This is what I am. I've used this before.
Is this the secret to life?
Well, there's a saying, if you find the right job, you never have to go to work.
That's quite an interesting statement.
And I haven't gone to work for 35 years.
How many people today don't have that satisfaction in what they do?
Well, a lot of my friends from the advertising days, my contemporaries, they're long gone. I think they died of boredom. They retired at 65 and had nothing more to do.
Yeah.
I find myself being as motivated at 87 as I was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Because this is really, this is heaven. I said to you one day, I would come to work for nothing. And I remember saying, don't quote me on that.
But it's true. I think there's a lot of people today which are missing out and not fulfilling their dreams and taking the risks involved to do something like,
it was risky starting this business.
Totally.
We were out on our own. We didn't really know what we were doing, but driven by passion. And when you believe in what you do, it's amazing. There isn't anything that can't be done.
Yeah.
And looking back at 35 years in this business, we've done things that I have to pinch myself that we've been able to do by just being determined and not quitting, not giving in.
Yeah. We're so lucky really to have such a good team of people behind us at Sleeping Beauties and people which have been loyal and have been with you for more than 35 years, some of them.
Well, as in most businesses, your greatest asset are the people that you've got working with you.
Totally.
I can't think of anybody loving old cars. To do this kind of stuff, it doesn't get any better. This is heaven.
Yeah. Tell me a bit about yourself and why did you come to Australia and when?
Well, I usually answer that question by saying I had to get away from my mother. Now that sounds somewhat strange, but it is real. My father died in the war. I was the only child, and by age 12, 13, I became the husband. My mother became possessive. It's called spaceification, and I had to get away.
Yep.
So in 1960, I felt I needed to get out of Berlin,
yes,
which was like a political island. So you were restricted. You couldn't go here, you couldn't go there. It's hard for people to understand how in the middle of Europe there can be an island, but that's exactly how it felt. So in 1960 I left and came over here. In those days, the Australian government paid all the expenses for immigrants to come to Australia. I was not a refugee, I was an immigrant. And it was very tricky because I really couldn't speak English, just enough to tell people that I was trained in Germany, and within 2 days had my first job.
So what did you do when you first came to Australia? Because it would have been a land you couldn't speak the language, and it would have been, what's your next step? Or were you by yourself, or did you have a friend? Or what happened?
I had a friend that had come here a year before,
yes,
and he told me it was fabulous. This was, in those days, Australia was the land of opportunities.
Yes.
It really was. And so I decided that it is the furthest I could get away from
from your mum.
My mother. I know it doesn't sound good, but that's the truth. So we had to sign up for a year, and then we were allowed to go back again.
Yes.
It took only a couple of months for me to realise that the things I could achieve in Australia in 1960, I could never have done in Germany. So it was 13 years before I returned to Germany for a visit. And by that time, I had my own business, and the rest, as I say, is history.
It's hard to imagine that 65 years ago is when you made this decision to come to Australia.
That's right.
You know, it's a long time. And it would have been a very different space, I imagine, coming to Australia then than what it is now.
Well, I came to Brisbane, and I liked it. There were some older buildings, there was sunshine.
Yes.
And I remember being in a place at Wollongabba, which was probably a kilometre from the City Hall. And I took a photo, and I can't find it anymore, but there was just the City Hall sticking up. There was no other high-rise building.
Wow.
And that's only 65 years ago. So it's a bit scary when you look at the skyline of Brisbane now, looking like Manhattan.
Yes.
Where's it all going to go?
Well, it's amazing the progress over 65 years, thinking that City Hall is maybe 8 stories or less.
Yeah. It's a bit scary, actually. We're moving at such an enormous pace. And but we need to talk about cars.
Yeah, well, we're getting there. Next thing is, so because you're 87 as of December last year.
Yes.
And, 87 years of life is, especially in your condition, is pretty amazing. And the fact that you're still working 5 days a week. But my question is, because it's,
I think I need a glass.
You should have.
I need a cup of tea.
Looking back at when you were born, because you were born in Berlin in 1936 or 37?
37.
37. And you were there when, really, just as the Nazi Party had formed government, I think.
Yep.
And you were there during everything that was happening. And then as the Russians came in, and you were living in Berlin when the Russians were coming in, I'm fairly sure.
Well, I remember it well.
Yes.
It all started rather spectacularly. Poland went in 3 days, France took 5 days, and Germany was on a roll. Now, I wasn't really aware of that because in those days I was 3, 4, 5 years old.
Yeah.
5 years later, 1945, it all came crashing down.
Well, you were just a kid.
I was 7.
Yeah.
And Berlin was like the Gaza Strip.
Yeah.
There was nothing left. But as a 7-year-old, I didn't really understand the significance of how terrible it all was.
Yeah.
I mean, there were dead horses, there were people in the trees, and everything was demolished. The Russians were fairly brutal when they entered Germany.
Yeah.
I survived, obviously, and the 50s allowed me to grow up, study, become a graphic designer, which is really my only skill. I know very little about cars, but I can talk about it. By 1960, I decided it was time to move on.
Yes. So when you started Sleeping Beauties, because Wolf started Sleeping Beauties in 1988.
Yes.
And what was the first car? Like, what made you decide that you're going to get into restoration?
Good question. A friend of ours, we were in the vintage car club together, old cars.
Yes.
And a friend rang us and said, can you recommend anyone to restore a 1935 Rolls Royce? It was a very tired car, half in pieces.
Yes.
And we couldn't recommend anyone. I mean, people were doing up old cars under houses and barns and sheds and lean-tos.
But why did he come to you? Because you had lots of cars at the time, or I think...
Yes.
Yes.
We had cars of our own.
Yes.
And we had a bit of credibility. By that time, I had formed the Mercedes-Benz Club of Queensland
Yes.
as a founding member. And we owned rather precious cars, which gave us the credibility. So we thought, okay, why don't we start a restoration business professionally? There's a big difference between doing up old cars and restoring them professionally. And people have asked me, well, what's the difference? And I would say about $50,000 to $100,000. So we knew we were doing the right thing, because within a year we had 40 cars in the shop. Now, a lot of them were just sitting there, taking up space and parked. It took us quite a while to make the whole business work properly, because we really didn't know what we were doing. We were passionate, enthusiastic, and as I always say, we were losing $5,000 a month. But I still had my advertising business going for the first 5 years, which paid for all that.
Yes.
Today, I think we probably have the largest restoration company in Australia.
I would say so.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Why did I sell it,
Well,
James?
you got to it.
You wouldn't take no for an answer. Well, I got to my early 80s and I was starting to wonder, how long can I continue this? Because it's incredibly rewarding. That's why we're doing it. But it's also very challenging. I mean, we usually start with a pile of shit
Yeah.
and turn it into an award-winning car after, tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I had the privilege of restoring a car for a Japanese collector in 1992-93.
Yes.
And it was his ambition to show the car at Pebble Beach, California.
What year was this?
92-93.
Okay.
And it ended up at Sleeping Beauties because by that time, we were accepted as the leader, certainly in Brisbane and Queensland, if not in Australia.
Yes.
We took it to Pebble Beach. We ended up with a podium finish. And it was an amazing experience, prompting me to create the desire to do this in my own car.
Yeah.
And so I found a car that was suitable in Belgium. It had come out from Poland, a Mercedes, of course.
Half a car, wasn't it?
It was half a car, yeah, less than half a car.
And you
because it had to be smuggled through the Iron Curtain into Western Europe. So it was all taken apart and half was lost. But there was a challenge. Like I say, there is nothing that can't be done. It only takes time and money.
And at the time, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you traded your show-winning, which was Concours at the time, your Gullwing,
Yes.
for this car.
Yes, I did. Well, for half a car. I wasn't married at the time, so there was no wife saying, "You've got to be kidding." So I just did it. And it took 8 years to restore the car.
Yes.
We took it to Pebble Beach. And there's always a class at Pebble Beach, one of 22 classes, for supercharged pre-war Mercedes. And there I was, together with 15 others. And some of them had been flown in from Switzerland, from Germany, Mercedes-Benz Classic Centre. And here was my humble $2 million 380 Cab A. But it was a rare car, one of 16 built. It was the Geneva Motor Show car in 1934. And we had built it to within an inch of its life to perfection.
Well, our team just did
Our team
incredible
did
job.
It was, and it was rewarded by practically winning the class on the podium.
Yes.
Now, I say to people, I drove up to the podium, and my then wife said, I thought I was going to pass out. It sounds like I'm exaggerating. Well, picture it this way. If Roger Federer was to win Wimbledon once again this year, he doesn't need the money, he's a very wealthy man. He's won it 6 times. If he won it yet again, he would throw himself on the ground and kiss the grass at Wimbledon.
Yes.
That's what it feels like to be on the podium in your own car at Pebble Beach.
Yeah.
It is, without any question, the most significant day of my life.
Yeah. Wow.
I have no idea how I got off the podium. Fortunately, a friend of mine took video footage.
With a 1934 380 Cabriolet A, he comes all the way from Queensland, Australia.
Oh, boy.
This is
Which allowed me to relive the moment because I was away with the fairies. My wife grabbed my knee and said, "It's okay, you've done it." And that is an incredible experience, a life experience. Many people
amazing.
don't ever get to experience anything like it.
In the automotive world, it really is the highest in classic cars.
Yeah.
It's as high as it gets.
It's like winning Wimbledon.
Yeah.
I've been to Pebble Beach many times. We had 2 podiums out of 3 entries from Sleeping Beauties, and it's probably our most treasured achievement
Yeah. Most,
so far.
most definitely.
Yeah,
In Germany, when you were there till 1960,
yeah.
you would have seen not only, obviously, the war prior, but you would have seen the amazing things with cars happening at that time. What shows and things did you see? Because, you know, when you were there, the 300 SL would have been released, and you would have been around when all this was happening.
I still have photos. In fact, the reason I ended up working and playing with cars, it started in my early teens.
Yes.
I remember taking photos of the first 300 SL Roadster, a brown car,
Yes.
the first gullwing in a showroom. In fact, in 1952, when the pre-gullwing was winning races,
194.
the 194,
Yep.
I went into the showroom and it was sitting there, and
Wow. In which showroom? In Berlin?
in Berlin, in the mercedes-benz showroom.
Wow.
And I remember walking over and I felt compelled to touch the car to make sure it was really there. And somebody said to me, "Don't touch it, it's magnesium, it will dent." It's amazing how that registered. I mean, that is 75 years ago. And I can close my eyes and I can be in that showroom right now.
Yes. Okay. It's pretty amazing, really, to see in the things that would have been. Like, the world must be just totally different in every single way compared to what it was at the time.
Yes, and I'm not really sure that it is for the better.
I tend to agree.
Well,
Yeah.
you know, we've enjoyed almost 80 years of peaceful existence. There were a few little wars like Vietnam and stuff like that, but we weren't really affected by that,
Especially not here.
especially here. But right now, it doesn't look all that promising. There are fires burning all over the place, and I don't know who's going to put them out.
Yeah. Well, there's so many different advances in technology, and it looks like the cars now are just really for one purpose. There's very little passion. There's very little. I don't know, you just don't have the same feeling that some of these classic cars do when it comes to having a soul. They're just almost inanimate objects just to do one purpose now.
Well, I've got an answer to that subject. When I started Sleeping Beauties in 1988,
Yes.
my graphic design business was doing very well. I was employing 22 people. But in the mid-'80s, computers took over.
Yes.
And I found myself in a position where you didn't need talent, you needed software.
Yeah.
And I thought, it's time to get out and follow my true passion, which had always been classic cars. I have a photo of mine on the wall at home. I'm 1 year old, and I'm holding a large model of a tin Beetle.
Yes.
So how long have I been into classic cars? About 86 years. When we started in 88, we decided we were just going to do vintage cars.
Yes.
Now, vintage cars are cars that are built between 1920 and 1930.
Correct.
The word comes from vingt, French for 20.
Interesting. Yes.
So when people say they've got a vintage Holden, it can't be. They came out in 1948.
Exactly.
We soon learned that whilst, we wanted to do vintage cars only because we loved old cars. A friend of mine and I started this thing. But we learned very quickly that in business, you've got to do the jobs that come through the door.
Yes.
And we were doing cars from the 50s and 60s. But we decided we were not going to go past 1970, 71, 72.
Yep.
And there was a reason. In fact, there were three reasons. It wasn't that we didn't like cars after 1970, because there are cars that are spectacular that were built much later. The reason was, in 1970, in the 70s, computers came in, electronics came in. We hate electronics. I mean, what's wrong with pulling a button to turn on the lights? It's
the way of the world, and you can't do anything about that.
I know,
yeah.
but the business that we're in at Sleeping Beauties, we have to be commercially viable.
Totally.
Anything later than mid-70s, the cars are full of plastic. Plastic can't be repaired. You can't get replacements because they're not that collectible, and they're not that collectible because they're not that valuable. And I always explain it this way. You can get an old Jaguar from the 50s, $100,000, doesn't matter what condition it's in. You get a Jaguar, a V12 from the 90s, and it's worth $16,000. But it is 10 times as complicated to restore than a 50s car, but the value isn't there. So you can't spend $100,000 on a $20,000 car. So that's why really we are focusing on the cars that we've got in the shop for the last 35 years.
Totally. But there are some outliers in, it's not that, like you said, we don't like modern cars in some of the worlds. Like, there's some other cars which are very collectible, which are in the 90s now and things like that. But it's not what we do here. We prefer pre-60s, really pre-70s classics, anything 300 SLs and various other models.
Yeah.
But getting back onto you, some other questions that I have. One of them is when you did come to Australia, so you went into graphic design and you didn't speak English, you were learning English at the time. And what made you decide to get into, so you had graphic design knowledge already and then you wanted to get into classic cars? Where was it, was computers that changed that, or?
Yes, it was. I got my job within days of arriving in Brisbane, simply because I had been trained in Berlin, Germany.
Yes.
The government, I think, brought young people like myself to Australia to be a breeding stock. Now, I didn't do too well on that front, but I joined a printing company.
What was the company?
H. Poland Company in West End, Brisbane.
Interesting.
I will never forget. And I struggled because of the language problem. But I had to learn, and because I wasn't... Most migrants come here in family situation. They go home and at night they speak Greek or Hungarian or Irish. The Irish think they speak English, and nobody has any idea what they're saying. I had to learn English.
Yes.
And I made a point of not learning Australian, but to learn to speak English. And I think it took a couple of years, and my English would have been better than my English teacher back in Germany. I've kept my German language alive, and my current third wife, we went to Germany, and I could break into Germany talking to people. And Lee said to the person, "How good is this German?" And they said, "Oh, it's perfect." So I've managed to keep that alive, and I'm very proud of that.
Yes, yes. Another question I've got, Wolf, is what sort of cars did you own? Like, what was... I know you had 300 SLs, a Roadster and a Goldwing, and you had the 380. Tell us a bit more about this and how you got these cars and what happened there.
I love talking about that. When I first came to Australia, I bought a 1947 Jaguar SS because it was a pre-war car built after the war. I fell in love with it, and it was totally useless. The friend that I was with had just bought a brand new Falcon. It just came out. But whenever we needed to do something special, like getting a bottle of milk at night, I would hop into my Jaguar and go and get the milk. After 2 years, I gave up. It just was... I was trying to restore it on the footpath, and I had no idea what to do. So that went, and I bought a Simca Vedette V8, a 2-litre V8, and Simca had just been sold to Ford, and everybody said to me, "You can't survive with that car. You need to have an Australian Holden." Well, I didn't know better in those days. So I remember I went to Coronation Drive to trade the Simca, because everybody said, when you're in Australia, you've got to have a Holden.
Yes.
Well, I drove it home, and I had never experienced anything so disappointing.
Yeah.
So I was stuck with it for 2 years, and I hated it. Until one night, I was in Australia for 3 years by that time. I saw in a dark car yard on the side of the road at Chermside a black 1951 Mercedes 170S. And I don't remember the value. I went back next day. I said, I have to have it. I paid it off for a year or so, hire purchase. That's what you did in those days. And I kept that car for 5 years as my everyday car. Yes. I loved it. I then bought myself a 59 Mercedes 220S Coupe, which I kept for 22 years. Now, remember, I was born with a prejudice towards German cars, especially Mercedes-Benz. I needed a car for business, got myself a Pagoda 280 SL, and I remember I had a partner at the time, and he was always sick, but he was very creative, so he's a valuable asset to the business.
Work partner or a different partner?
He was a fellow director.
Okay.
Yeah, very creative. Creative people are very difficult. The more creative they are, the more difficult they are. And I remember he was away on holidays or sick again, and I said, look, I've just leased an old Mercedes. Oh, well, he said, nothing to worry about. He didn't realise it was a 280 SL. So the cracks started to appear in our relationship, and he eventually went. And I kept the business for the next 20 years.
Yeah.
The 300 SL Roadster, I found it, I mean, we're talking about a car that is today $2-3 million worth.
So you got a 300 SL.
So
Tell me.
I saw a 300 SL in Melbourne. A friend took me there looking at a collection.
Or a Gullwing?
No, Roadster,
Okay.
the red Roadster.
Yes.
And I said to the guy, if ever you want to sell this car, and we're talking 1977, if ever you want to sell this car, give me a call. But he said, well, it's my wife's car, it's not for sale. I said, I understand that, but you couldn't call me unless I told you I was interested. 2 years went by, and he rang me, and he said, she's sick of it. Do you still want the Mercedes? And I said, well, yes, I do. I said, how much is it? And he said, it was $28,500. And I said, I don't have $28,500.
But what year was this? This
would be 77.
Okay. Well, that would have been a lot of money in 1977.
It was a lot of money, but, you know, nothing compared with 2 or 3 million today. It's exploded.
Yes.
So he said, well, you don't need the money. You have a business. You can lease it. And I said, well, I don't know that I can lease an old sports car from a leasing company. He said, well, no, you can't. But he was a prominent car dealer in Melbourne. He arranged the lease for me. But in those days, the leasing company was worried leasing you an old car. I mean, it was then 30 years, 40 years old. And you had to sign a contract that you would buy the car at the residual.
Yes.
So that they wouldn't be stuck with an old car.
At the end, yeah.
I bought my 300 SL Roadster for $7,000. I sold it 8 years later for $85,000, only to buy a Gullwing.
Yes.
Which I found in San Diego. I kept that for 5 years. And people always say, which one is a better car to own? Well, the Roadster is much more user-friendly. It's a later car. But if I won the elusive 20 million tomorrow, I would buy myself another Gullwing for $3 million, give my wife the rest of the money, and I don't care if it's just an ornament, because at 87 I would struggle getting in and out of it. But I think a Gullwing is probably the ultimate, the first ever supercar, in my opinion.
Yes, yes. So, yeah, well, talking about some other cars that you had, I know that you had a 328 BMW.
Oh, yes.
That's 37, wasn't it?
Yeah, 36, 37, I forget. But it was a car that won the Australian Grand Prix in 1948.
Yes, wow.
In Melbourne at Point Cook.
Yes.
And I heard about it when I first came to Australia, and it was £7,000. Well, I had just built a house for £10,000, and I couldn't afford to buy a car for that money. It came back on the market 5 years later, and it was then $20,000.
Yes.
It's a long story, but I did end up with the car, and I kept it for probably 5-6 years.
Yes.
Lost it in a divorce. I could never replace the BMW.
And then you had a heap of other cars. You bought the K. You had 2 Ks, wasn't it? Or what?
Yes. Oh, well, that's a rather fascinating story. There was a huge car rally in Adelaide, and that would have been in the early 70s for pre-war vintage cars. And there were hundreds of them. And I had just restored a 190 SL, which is not vintage, it's 1956-7.
Post-war, yeah.
I rang the organisers in Adelaide and I said, I'd like to participate in this rally. And they said, what have you got? And I said, I've got a 1957 190 SL. And I remember she said, that'll do. She probably didn't realise it was completely out of context with the rest of the cars.
Totally.
Well, I drove it to Adelaide, which was a hell of a journey. And I participated in this rally. Everybody knew the silver 190 SL because it stood out with all the old cars. But people liked it. It's a pretty car, and it was nice. There was a huge dinner at the end of the rally in the then Chrysler canteen. Took 400 people.
Yes.
And opposite me sat a guy, and he noticed my Mercedes star on my lapel for the dinner.
Yes.
We were all dressed up. And he said, "What kind of Mercedes have you got?" And I said, "Well, I've got the little silver 190 SL. Oh, he said, "Yeah, I've seen it." He said, "You should have a pre-war Mercedes." And I said, "Yeah, where do you get one of those?" He said, "Well, I have a friend
Sorry?
in Melbourne, in Mount Eliza. He's got two of them.
Yes.
One is only a chassis." I said, "Well, that's the one I want. I don't think I can afford the real car." Well, no emails, no mobile phones in those days. So on the way back from Adelaide, I called in at Mount Eliza. The woman answered the door, and I said, "I'd like to speak with the owner." And she said, "He doesn't live here anymore." Oh dear, things were a bit messy. But she gave me his phone number, and I rang him, Brian. I spoke with Brian, and I said, "Brian, I'm told that you have two supercharged Mercedes, one chassis only. I'm interested in buying that. You've got two, I've got none." He said, "It's not for sale." I said, "Okay, if it was for sale, what would you ask?" He said, "It's not for sale." I said, "I'll tell you what I'll do, Brian. I will send you a note every 6 months in the mail that I would like to buy the chassis of your 1927K Mercedes supercharged." He said, "Well, you're wasting your time." I said, "Well, I'm just going to do that." I got back to Brisbane. I instructed my then secretary to send the letter, and then forgot all about it. 10 years went by, and I got a call from a solicitor in Melbourne. I love this story. I love telling it. And the guy said, "Do you still want that old Mercedes here in Melbourne?" I said, "Well, yes, I do." I said, "How did you know about me?" He said, "Well, the owner murdered someone, is in jail for life, and I'm tidying up his affairs."
Oh, goodness. Yeah.
So I said, "How do you know about me?" I said, "I found a huge packet of letters from you."
So he obviously kept them.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Well, she sent him. I'd forgotten all about it. She was a good secretary. She sent him, he kept him, and I said, "Well, okay, now what kind of money we're talking?" And he said $55,000. I said, "Good God, that's a lot of money for the chassis." He said, "No, that's a chassis and the car." Well, that was a bargain.
Yeah.
I got them. They arrived in Brisbane. We built one car. Even the second car was in pieces. But we put it together a year or so, and we built the SSK out of the other one.
Yes.
I sold the early car for $250,000 a couple of years later.
Yes.
Which meant I got my SSK virtually for nothing.
And what year was that then?
What year was that then? Yes, I think back of my divorce,
Okay.
about 81, 82.
Yes, okay. That would have been a lot of money for a car at that time.
Oh, yes. It was amazing. I couldn't believe it. It was a German guy that offered me the 250,000.
Yes.
And the SSK probably was the most exciting car that I've ever owned. Not just owned, but driven and raced it.
Yes.
I raced it at the Adelaide Grand Prix in the supporting races, not in Formula One. And at Albert Park in Melbourne,
Yes.
I found myself on the track with the late Sterling Moss.
Yes. Wow. Incredible.
He passed me in his Grand Prix car. And
Which one
and
was he driving?
W125.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Amazing.
Yes. And he waved as he passed me. And I remember the Castrol R. I stopped breathing. I just inhaled it for a couple of laps. Those were exciting days.
Definitely.
It was fabulous stuff. I mean, I was then 30, 40 years younger.
Mm.
But I still have a house full of classic cars, and I treasure them. And if you said to me, which is your favourite, the one that I'm in on the day.
Lovely. So, one other question which I have
Yes.
is, when it comes to the car scene of today, and because in the classic cars, what was it like in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s? Because, I look back at the photos, which is lifetimes before I was even alive.
Yeah.
And you can't help but ask the question, what was it like then? Is it similar to today, or what was it? Yeah, I just don't understand.
I think from a styling point of view, the 30s were the most exciting.
Yes.
Because people weren't preoccupied with economy. There were cars that were just transport.
Right.
But the collectible cars as we see them today were never as beautiful ever after the 1930s. They were just spectacular.
Yes.
The engineering, my SSK, supercharged with an engine and chassis designed by Dr. Porsche, who worked at that time for Mercedes-Benz.
Yes.
It was something, there were works of art.
It comes to mind.
I don't really remember anything from the 40s because I was born in late 37, so I was a child.
Yeah.
And my mother never had a car. I don't think my father ever had a car.
Wow.
That's a long, long time ago.
Yes.
Now, the 50s, as we said, I became aware of the Gullwing, the 300 SL. I've got pictures taken in front of the showroom in Berlin with the 300D in the window.
Beautiful.
And my girlfriend at the time thought I was having my photo taken with her. She didn't realize it was all about the car in the background, not about the girl. I remember the car. I don't remember the name of the girlfriend. But
Terrible.
yeah, but there were the 328 we touched on. I remember buying it from a collector in Melbourne who also had a 1937 SS 100 Jaguar.
Yes.
And I kept pestering him to sell me the 328 because it was German and it was nice and I wanted it. And in the end, he sold me the 328. And I remember saying, why did you keep the Jaguar and sell the 328? He said, well, there's 20 years between the two. He said, the Jaguar is 10 years behind the times. It was really old technology.
Yes.
And the 328 was 10 years ahead of its time. And yet they were built in the same year. The reason he kept the Jaguar, he had owned it for 20 years.
Yes.
And he finally let me have the 328.
Well, they said at the time, even into the 50s, into the 60s, I think, the 328 was one of the best sports cars ever made.
Well, George Monkhouse, who is an English motoring journalist expert, he said the 328 may well have been the most successful sports car of all time.
Yeah.
Coming from an Englishman, that was one hell of a statement. Yes, I loved it. I went to the car club the other night and they showed video footage, it was 9mm, turned into sticks, of the club activities in the early 70s.
Yes.
And every now and then, there's all these cars running around Lakeside racing. And there was this flash of silver going by, and that was a 328. It was just magnificent. And God, I would love to get one again today. But now I paid $20,000. They're all past $1 million now. It's a funny thing, the really rare super collectible cars are going through the roof, and everything else is kind of sliding by the wayside. That's the way it is. You can't argue with the marketplace.
No. Well, that's why we always recommend you're better off buying the rarest car you can and getting something which is, like a 300 SL or something that you can use that is one really good car, if that's all you want. And if not, you can buy lots of different ones. But
it reminds me of an answer that I've given to a lot of people when I owned the business. There was no social media and really no emails. People would simply ring and say, I have a car to be restored. And I remember saying that half of the phone calls, I'd talk people out of it.
we still do.
We still do. There was either the wrong car, they shouldn't be spending money on restoring it, or it was the wrong owner. And you could detect that fairly quickly. I used to say, you don't restore a car unless you feel you can't live without it. It's like you don't marry a girl because you had a dance. You really want to make sure this has got to be for life. And it's the same with investing in a classic car. You've got to do your homework. You've got to know what you're getting in for, because it will take twice as long and it will cost twice as much as what you think. And that still has to be acceptable when you finally get the delivery. I always used to say, don't do it for investment. If the car turns out to be a good investment, that's a bonus. You want the car because you just can't live without it.
Well, on that note, I think we can pretty much say that concludes the first podcast. However you finish. Oh, yeah. Thanks, Wolf, for...
And I'll finish my drink.
Well, it'd be rude not to.
Cheers. Pause this, we
I'm
say
going
in
to pour
Berlin.
myself some more.
Oh, that was good fun.
Yeah, it was good.
Yeah.
You were very natural with it,
Well,
of course.
I've spoken to, some people say, talk about it is all Wolf can do. And that's okay.
No comment.
That's okay.